So this is an overview of a project that I've been working on for some time now, and when you give a talk you can decide to go into great detail with respect to a particular topic, and that is often what is demanded within the discipline of philosophy alone, and rightly so. But you can also choose to go more broadly and try to present an overview of a larger project, and that is what I'm doing here. So it is, from a philosophical standpoint, short on argument, so it lacks detail often. And if you're interested, I hope we can fill in the details. But what it lacks in detail, it has in breadth and, let us say, the span, the scope of the claims being made. And I hope it hangs together well, and maybe you can help me figure out if it doesn't. So let me just jump right in. Now, you might ask, this is a project on intergenerational justice, where I, by the way, understand the term justice to be both an ontological and a normative term, but that will emerge as we go along. So you may ask, why do we need to talk about this now? Well, you know, every generation has its intergenerational responsibilities, I think, so we are not unique. We, the currently living, are not unique in that respect. But I do think that there is something very special about our time when it comes to the kind of power that we now have in affecting future people, very distant future people. So it's both the power of the impact and its long-lasting reach that we now have with nuclear weapons and with the possibilities of environmental destruction, that is indeed unique. So for something like 50 to 60 years, human beings have had a power that is unprecedented, I think. And it has become not just a question of containing nuclear arsenal in terms of both its civil and its military uses in preventing large-scale and far-reaching environmental destruction, but also sort of the slow processes of environmental degradation and climate change and deforestation and so on. So, and what's also interesting about this is that not only do we have the power to have these long-term effects, we have increasingly also better and more secure knowledge of these effects. And with this power and with this knowledge, arguably, intergenerational justice, justice between present and future generations becomes more pronounced and more urgent and more important for us. Now, I like to begin discussions by quoting US President Obama. It's actually not his line, it is from the governor of Washington State, and Obama incorporated it into his speech before the United Nations in the fall of 2014. It's always problematic to quote politicians in an academic talk, because some may like the politician, others don't, and so you get yourself into that kind of mess. And of course, it may always be that the politician is just posturing, is just talking like this because it will win votes, or it's just a maneuver in a strategic game, and there's always the danger of that. But I nonetheless, I like this. And the reason I do is because it does something that I think is very important for us today, given the intergenerational situation and the responsibilities that we find ourselves in. Because what it does for me is that if you read it right, that is, you read it a little bit more than, let's say, a political pundit would, then it does say that we are a unique generation with a unique responsibility. So it says what I just said, but it also inserts us into a long-term chain of generations because it refers to us as the first and the last generation, and thereby implies that there are many generations before us and after us. And we have to understand ourselves as at a particular juncture in these generational chains. And you can flesh this out more by talking about climate change. How do we know that climate change is taking place and that it is anthropogenic? For example, ice core drilling is very important to this, so we can model the climate. Ice core drilling takes us back 650,000 years. And some of the knowledge we have about greenhouse effects stem from the last time there was a major greenhouse effect, what's called the thermal maximum. Does anyone know when that took place? You can't do this by ice core drilling. You have to do rock sedimentation analysis, and that takes you back 55 million years ago. So maybe we wouldn't want to talk about human generations going that far back. But you see that if you parse this out, then you get a picture of the necessity of thinking our present time and our generation as having a responsibility that is on the one hand unique, but also requires that we understand ourselves as only one generation. So there's a sense we're unique, but we're only one. That is the task here. And maybe that's new. Maybe that's new. Okay. Now, so how then do we understand these generational relations? Now, if you look at the literature, the existing literature on intergenerational justice, then most of it is most of what I can access, and what I can access is either in German, English, or in French. And I also read Latin and Greek, but that doesn't help. And so I have to say that is the literature I'm drawing upon here. So I don't know what there is in Chinese, in Japanese, and in the many other languages and cultures. But most of the literature is in fact on this topic. It has been written in English. There's quite some interesting and good stuff in French, and there is some stuff in German, but most of the literature that is explicitly devoted to intergenerational relations is English, and that is reviewed here a little bit. And I think most of it is falls into one of these categories here. And all of them are problematic for me, and they all have the same problem for me. And you know, I'm going very quickly here, but so the first is to say, oh, by the way, this literature emerged mostly in the 1970s, and that was not because of climate change or environmental destruction, it was because of the nuclear capabilities. That's the paradigmatic case in the first literature on intergenerational justice in the 1970s is about nuclear waste. So what do we do with nuclear waste? And should we be using, for military and civil purposes, nuclear energy? It's obviously a big question here in Japan as well. And so what are we doing to future people by using nuclear energy, building nuclear bombs, producing nuclear waste, and so forth? Most of the literature, in fact, goes along this route. It says, look, the problem of future generations is a pretty difficult problem. So what kind of relation do we have to them? They are non-existent. Can they have rights? How should we think of them? I mean, they don't exist, right? We don't know exactly what their needs will be, and we don't have reciprocity relations with them and so forth. So it's pretty difficult to think about. What we should do is we should take our existing well worked out theories of justice and extend them to future people. So most famously in John Rawls's Political Liberalism from 1995, he says that he has developed a theory of justice for the domestic and contemporary realm, and now we have to extend it to the relations to other nations. That's a problem of extension, to other generations, to the disabled, and to animals. So future generations belong with animals, as it were, as a problem of extension. Right? But it's not just him, it's also others who have argued along similar lines. Let's take the kinds of theories we have and see whether we can extend them. Now notice what that means. It means that the theory that you have didn't consider generations, and therefore it took human beings to not be generational beings, right? And that shows up in certain places. Now another one is to say that, it should say stage here, by the way. That's an error. Hiroshi pointed this out to me earlier today. So another one is to say, and I've had debates with some of these people, with both of them actually. I've had debates at conferences, and it's actually very hard to get them to move away from this. But what they say is, and you know, it's somewhat reasonable. What they say is, look, it's a special problem. Future generations is very difficult to think of. So let us make sure we don't mix in the problem of future people with the problem of contemporaries. And to model the problem of future people correctly, we have to get away from everything that makes the relationship to future people impure. We have to model it in its pure state. We want to know why and what do we owe future people, not people with whom we overlap. So let's abstract from overlaps. Let's model the problem as purely as we can. And sort of the most egregious or most illustrative form of that is what they call the time bomb problem. It's very hard for them not to think of it that way because, look, we're trying to isolate the relation to future people for its normative moral import, and that's why we have to abstract from all this overlap. Right? Again, what happens is, it's for certain purposes it makes a lot of sense. But what you take the human being to be is a being that lives in the present. Right? So this assumption that you have the stage of history, as it were, and generations come on stage whole cloth, they leave, and the next one comes. It leaves, and the next one comes. That's the assumption. Right? Okay. Or you have the two-theory approach. Probably Lucas Bayer's approach is most famous for that. It basically says that the problem of future people is so specific that it's better to have a separate theory of justice for them. One for contemporaries, one for them. And internally, if you read that, it's very well motivated. But again, it says that justice is such that it isn't intrinsically intergenerational. So normativity, justice, the reason why we owe one another responsibilities, that has nothing to do with generations intrinsically. So goes the claim. More extreme is Brian Barry's reading of an earlier approach by Rawls in the theory of justice. Rawls has different, you know the book, I think, but he has sort of three models of how to think about future generations. And the first two he dismisses very quickly within one paragraph. But the first one is, in fact, this idea that what we should do to figure out what generations owe one another is that we should think of generations as meeting all generations that ever will have lived and ever will live as meeting in one room, as it were, at one time. And then they have to talk about not knowing what generation they will end up being. They have to talk about what justice among generations would look like. Right? That kind of. I call that the dehistoricizing approach because it takes human beings to not be intrinsically historical beings, that time is not intrinsic to them, and also not generational time, about which I will say more in a moment. In Brian Barry, it takes the form of where he has a footnote, and I really like this, where he says, well, but what if at the meeting of these generations they decided that they couldn't come up with workable, agreeable principles of justice, and so decided not to come into being at all, right? So not to live, not to become historical beings. And that shows you that something is ontologically not right here. We're not modeling, we're not thinking of the human being in the right way, that it could decide not to come into existence. Okay, so I mean, obviously a lot more could be said about this, but I'm trying to show you the motivation that leads me to say we should think human beings, generations, generational time, and justice. We should think these together. We should maybe rethink what it is to be a human being such that these kinds of approaches are avoided. Maybe, at a later stage of theory development, you still want to abstract for certain purposes from overlap, right? Because you want to, maybe, it depends on where your theory goes, but it may be that for certain purposes you still want to do it, but with the proviso and with the caution that you have rethought the human being in such a way that you have considered the role of generational time for human beings. So my worry is just that you fall into what I call a presentist conception of the self. Presentist, it lives in the present. It is only contemporary. And relations to other generations, to the past and to the future, are not essential to it. And against that, and here are some reasons for thinking that, where you can elaborate that, and where this has already become an issue in the literature. So for example, in the so-called liberal communitarian debate, and there's some literature, especially Avner de Shalit, an Israeli author, and Jana Thompson, an Australian author, who have developed communitarian critiques of the assumptions that I just outlined, although they take them in a different direction than I do. So maybe that is familiar to you. I can't go into this debate for reasons of time. Maybe you know a little bit the work of the Canadian political theorist C.B. Macpherson, who has argued that European modernity is governed by and driven by the conception of a self that has no obligations to anyone. It starts with a human being that owns himself and thereby extends ownership from himself to nature and its resources and so on. I mean, the model there, or very well-known model there, is John Locke, the Second Treatise of Government, but also other authors. For C.B. Macpherson, this is a charge. This charge of possessive individualism applies to all social contract theories of the modern tradition. So it would include Hobbes and Rousseau and Rawls as well. So that there's a kind of individualism that is, in particular, it's possessive. So it's geared towards possession of territory and resources. And you can also connect this to certain texts of Heidegger and the French reception of Heidegger, where there is a diagnosis of the metaphysics of presence that ties in well with what I call presentism here, where there's an account of the history of Western philosophy that privileges the present over the past and the future. And in particular, in the age of subjectivity, you could say, such a privileging takes the form of a kind of possessiveness. So there are other kinds of accounts that you can sort of plug in here. We don't have the time, or I don't want to go into that into great detail. But what I do want to do now is to say that what's crucial is in responding to this present, what I call the presentist conception of the self, is to rethink selfhood and human agency in such a way as to explore generational time. And by generational time, I mean what I also call the time of birth and death. So the significance of birth, which links us to previous generations, and death, which links us to future generations. So let us see whether we can really abstract from birth and death, or whether birth and death are not central to human agency, and therefore to justice. And you can see where this is going. Of course, my argument is going to be birth and death. The time of birth and death is central to a conception of moral subjectivity, such that justice is always, from the beginning, also intergenerational. That is where this is going. Now, how can you make this claim? Well, philosophers would say, well, you can't just claim that, well, we're all born and we're all going to die, right? Because those are empirical facts about us, and someone who is a defender of extensionism or the two-theory approach or the abstractive approach and so on could say, yeah, of course, I mean, how could I not concede that? But that's not central to agency, right? For modeling my moral subject and the relations of that moral subject to future generations, I don't have to take that into account, somebody could say, because these are empirical facts. Like when I model my subject, I also don't take nose length into account, or hair color, or skin color. I don't take those into account. I abstract from those in order to give an account of moral subjectivity. And so someone could say, birth and death, they're not central they're empirical facts for sure, but they're not central to a conception of agency. And again, so you have to be able to say something in response to that. To do that, I draw on Heidegger, Levinas, Hannah Arendt, Luce Irigaray, and a number of other thinkers. But I know that some of you here are familiar with Heidegger, working on Heidegger, and the basic argument in Heidegger's first major work, Being and Time, is in fact that human agency draws on or lives in a finite temporality in which the relationship to death is constitutive of agency, central to agency. You can't do without it. He calls this being towards death. Now you might say, well, why is that? Well, it's a long account. It's a big book, and it doesn't lend itself to easy summary. But for the purposes of this talk, it's hard to avoid. So the argument goes something like this, in a very sketchy form. To be an agent is to understand one's present time not as if it was fixed, but as to be. So it's central that you see your own time as full of possibilities, so that your current situation isn't trapped into a causal chain, but is in fact such that there are possibilities that you can realize, and others that you can then no longer realize. Right? So choosing one possibility means losing other possibilities, opening up new ones, hopefully, but closing doors to other possibilities. That's what it is to be an agent. So an agent has to display a temporality that isn't a linear temporality, right? That isn't just a straight line. That can't be it, because then there wouldn't be any any agency. There wouldn't be any possibilities for choice. But the realization of possibilities demands that my life is grasped as mortal. That is, to grasp my time as to be is also to grasp this to be as not forever to be, but as having a finite structure to it. That is as coming to an end at some point. Now, why is that? I have found over the years that the quickest way to explain that without, as it were, going through being a time is by drawing upon Simone de Beauvoir's novel, All Men Are Mortal. You know the novel? Because it gets much more complicated in the novel. But basically there is a character who is not mortal. He takes a potion in the early Middle Ages and he becomes immortal. And when we, the readers, encounter Fosca, that is his name, he is totally incapable of acting. Nothing interests him. Anything has lost any sort of interest for him, and he's very destitute. He regains a little bit a sense of the meaningfulness of life by engaging in a love relationship with a woman who is motivated to be associated with him who is immortal because she wants him to remember her forever. So she wants immortality and he wants her mortality. So you see, it's very interesting the way that the novel is set up. But basically what this means is if you were immortal, then it wouldn't matter that you're spending time with us here. It wouldn't matter because it wouldn't rule out anything else. It wouldn't matter that you choose to become a philosopher because you could be a philosopher for 500 million years and you could also then still become a hairdresser or a carpenter or what have you for another 500 million years. It makes no difference what you choose, right? So this is gives you at least an inkling as to why Heidegger would claim that being towards death is disclosive of agency. So you require that relationship to death. So you can't take the mortality out of the human being and still take it to be a human agent. You can't do that. Right? That's what this establishes. Now, we're going very quickly here. Levinas has then, so the French philosopher Emmanuel Levinas has basically said, well, that's all great. He calls this a necessary passageway, a passage obligatoire. So you got to do being in time. Before you do anything else, you have to do being in time. However, there's one crucial point where he disagrees with Heidegger, and that is that he thinks that death is not just individuating. It's not just what gives me my singular capacity for agency, not just, because it does that too, but death is inseparable from other people. If I am mortal, then I am also affectable by others. Death and other people cannot be accessed independently of one another. Whenever you access your mortality in order to disclose possibilities for action, you will encounter other people. Now you might have questions about why he makes that point, and we can talk about that if you want. Maybe I can defer that a little bit. But it's actually a widespread notion, especially in French philosophy after the Second World War, this idea that with death come other people, and that you can't separate these two. Okay, so that's now if that's true, however, so if in encountering one's death, one also encounters other people who, like us, are thereby rendered by mortality, are rendered vulnerable, rendered affectable. So they're not immortal, but they can be affected. They are vulnerable. Then agency is always opened up, or always comes to birth, in relationship to another person who can outlive me. right? Who can live beyond my life, whose lifespan may extend beyond mine. Right? So then it's not just that I need to access death in order to disclose my agency, but in that disclosure, I am at the same time accessing a world of people beyond my death. So there is a world of people beyond my death, and Levinas argues that mortality always, mortality on the face of another person always calls on me not to kill the other person. So mortality comes with a demand. It does so in Heidegger too. In Heidegger, it comes with a basic demand, the call of conscience, to disclose possibilities of agency for me. That's what he calls authenticity. In Levinas, the claim is yes, but the demand to responsibly disclose possibilities is always undertaken in view of another who may outlive me. So this is what he calls being for beyond my life. So from being towards death, we go to being for beyond my life. Okay. So that means then that the generational relation to future people is co-constitutive of agency, if that argument goes through. Similarly, the relationship to previous generations. So that's a relationship to future generations, but you can make a similar argument drawing on some related literature also coming out of a reading of Being and Time with respect to birth. And you can, I mean, the most famous argument in that respect that privileges what is then called natality, so the relevance of birth for human agency, you find in Hannah Arendt's book, The Human Condition. Hannah Arendt, like Levinas, a student of Heidegger's, also drawing on Being and Time to some extent, but now making natality, the fact of birth, more central. And there the argument then is that each time we act, as it were, we are giving birth to ourselves anew. We are drawing upon the fact that our birth was not a birth into a mere causal chain, a birth, for example, into a species where our species being would determine what we do and how we act out possibilities. Now that's how Hannah Arendt thinks of animals. I'm not sure I want to go with her on that, but you get the idea. So if birth was just birth into a causal chain, there wouldn't be any freedom either. Birth has to be such that it is birth into a causal chain that I can interrupt or that I can begin, as Kant would say. And so each time I act then, I reenact the fact that my birth was not a birth into a fixed deterministic causal chain. That's basically the conception of natality. So now, and several authors in the literature, in particular Irigaray, Caballero, and Lisa Günther, have then argued that this account of birth implies not just the ontological significance of birth, but implies a normative relationship to previous generations. You can see why this would be of particular relevance to feminists, because the birth giver is the mother. So in Luz Irigaray's conception, the mother plays a big role, her claim being that most models of subjectivity, in fact, suppress the relationship, the birth-giving relationship to the mother. Okay, so, but what we then end up with is that agency is to be thought as discontinuously linked to one's birth, and thus also to previous generations. So what we then have, if these arguments with respect to mortality and natality go through, is that we have a socio-ontological and normative conception of agency in which birth and death are not just empirical accidents, but are co-constitutive of human agency. That's what we end up with. So you could say what we are generational beings in N.O. Burns' recent phrase. So the opposite of the present to self, if you wish. That's what you would end up with. And then what I want to ask is, okay, so what does this tell us about intergenerational justice? Suppose that is our conception of what a human being is, then how should we think about what we owe future people? Now, what it has to do is that this kind of theory of justice, it has to be normatively and social-ontologically adequate. So it has to model or grasp the human being ontologically in the right way in its social relations, but it also has to understand the moral relationship to previous and future generations in such a way that it doesn't cut them off, right? It has to take them into account right from the beginning. So what we have is then temporally, the time of birth and death shows that previous generations and future generations are co-given in the present, as it were, and are not just, well, there's just past and future, and so the one is dead and gone, and the other one, well, doesn't exist yet, so we can just, do without that. No, you can't. They are co-present in the present, is the claim. So that means you have to come up with conceptions of moral, social, and political relations among generations that do justice to this co-implication of the past and the future in the present. And so the next step then is to look for these kinds of understandings of intergenerational relations in their moral, political, and social significance that takes that into account. So, and I've basically developed two asymmetrical reciprocity and taking turns, so models that do that I think do that, that is, do justice to this co-implication of past and present past and future in the present. But asymmetrical reciprocity I'm not going to talk about because of time. So that is the conception of asymmetrical reciprocity. Then I did a nice picture as best as I could. So you can see these are generations, and I have 4 different kinds of reciprocity relations. So one generation, every preceding generation gives birth to, and that means more than just literally giving birth to a generation. It therefore has a relationship to it, has a moral relationship to it, but it discharges it to the next generation. So you get this kind of 3-party relation, sort of interlocking chains, you get pretty thick, you can see pretty thick intergenerational relations if you explore this. Most of the literature on this, by the way, is economic, because it's economists who are interested in reciprocities among generations, intergenerational transfers, and so on. And in 2 chapters that I have on this, one chapter draws on that economic literature. That's quite interesting in that in that context, even though the economic literature always has the drawback that it limits itself to material transfers. So giving birth, as a mother does, doesn't show up. And only very few models would take into account something like care relations, and that is a drawback. But other than that, there's good thinking. But the title that I gave to this talk today is Taking Turns with the Earth. So I'm going to go to the taking turns model. The reciprocity model is, by and large, you could say, it's good when, or it helps when you're dealing with, how substitutable items, as it were. So when one person gives another person something that needs to be substituted because it exhausts itself in the giving. And so you need to give in response, but you need to give something else, as it were. You can't give the same thing. And that is actually the standard model among economists for thinking of reciprocity. And it's also a standard model when it comes to thinking sustainability. I think that taking turns can help us come up with a different model. Taking turns is when what you are, or it's more useful when what you are dealing with in terms of sharing isn't a substitutable thing, but is a holistic item where elements of it may exhaust themselves, but not it itself exhausts itself in the giving. So, there are certain kinds of things that are obvious candidates for this. Language, for example. The way we share language is very different from the way that we share food. Food exhausts itself in the sharing, right? Because we eat it up. But language doesn't. Which is why you could say when you share language, it becomes more in the sharing, not less, right? But only on a certain conception. As the title of the talk indicates, where I want to go is to the holistic object I have in mind is the sharing of the environment, is taking turns with the earth. Now, why do we get to taking turns, briefly? Now, I've said that we have to think time as co-implying in the present, the past, and the future. Past and future generations as not just cut off from the present, but as implicated in the present. That is what natality and mortality were supposed to help us see, this co-implication. Now, why does taking turns recommend itself for thinking the co-implication of past and future in the present? Because, again, to go relatively quickly, because when you think such a co-implication, you have to think the present, so you still have to think the present, you have to think presence, but as intrinsically related to past and future. Now, so what you have to think is the uniqueness, the singularity, the irreplaceability of the now, of the present moment, but in such a way that that irreplaceability is related to its coming to be from and its passing away into, that is being replaced by another now, the one it gives way to. And that's what taking turns can do, because the turning indicates this coming to be and already passing away. That's the turning nature of time. But the turn is that irreplaceability of the present. That's the idea. So that what you're trying to think together is, on the one hand, the uniqueness of each now, as it were, but on the other hand, the fact that, well, it's only in the process of coming to be from a past and already passing away into the future. So you do justice to some of the necessity of thinking the present, but not in such a way that you thereby cut it off from past and future. This is a way of thinking about time that I think is best developed in Heidegger's text on the Anaximander fragment and in Derrida's Rogues, where taking turns is discussed explicitly as a model for thinking time. So the phrase taking turns is not to be found in Heidegger, but that's because German doesn't have a good phrase for taking turns. We talked a little bit about Japanese in that respect, and I'd like to hear more about how you say taking turns. And what it implies. That's of relevance in this context. But it's not easy to say that in German. That's not to say that the notion of taking turns doesn't exist. Of course it does. I mean, every time you play a game of chess or some other board game, you need to be able to talk about taking turns, because it's basically what's required. But also, if you do some, and I've done this, if you do some research on where does the notion of taking turns show up, where is it discussed in academic literature, for example, there's next to nothing in the philosophical literature. There is a little bit in Aristotle and Plato on democracy, but it's sharing offices, not objects, and it's not about time for them. It's just a question of reconciling freedom and equality. There's one article on intergenerational justice where taking turns is discussed, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But other than that, there isn't much literature on it. But beyond philosophy, there is linguistic discussions of taking turns, because we take turns speaking. So in sociolinguistics and in eco-linguistics, the notion of taking turns is discussed because it seems central to the phenomenon of speech. And so there's some literature there. And that's also because that language, I think, has certain kinds of features that recommend taking turns. But that's somewhat different from what I want to talk about here. So then, if taking turns is a good model for thinking the co-implication of past and future in the present, then could we not develop taking turns in the direction of sharing among generations? Is my question. And the answer is, I think you can work it up and develop it in such a way that it is useful for those purposes. You must first go from time to applying it to identity. The identity of an agent, for example, consists then in taking turns over time with a past and a future self in order to come back to itself, but thereby already opening itself up to taking turns with another. So that is, for example, how Derrida in Rogues thinks the relationship of turn takers when it comes to democratic sharing of offices. So he reads together Aristotle on the katameros, that is on sharing offices by taking turns, with his model of time. That's how he opens Rogues and reads them together. So that's basically developed in that text. But then if you apply it to generations, which is what Derrida does not do, then you get the sense that a generation exists only by taking turns with holistic objects with previous and future generations. Right? That is the kind of model you then get for thinking intergenerational relations. The model is no longer of sharing a resource by cutting it up, by taking it apart and giving this to one generation and this to another generation. The model now is one of generations taking turns with each other, which co-implies past and future generations in the generation that is taking its turn right now. Right? So, maybe it becomes clearer if I talk about what I call the advantages to intergenerational justice as taking turns. So thinking about it in terms of taking turns. First, I think one of the things that's good about it is that it's readily accessible to common intuitions, even though the way I parse it out and develop it, it gets a little bit richer and more involved, as it were, and it may then lose some of its appeal. But we all know what it is to take turns, right? Because that's what you learn as children. There you have to take turns with, going on the swing on the playground. It's something we learn very early on. And what do we say to, let's say, a rambunctious kid who really wants to go on the swing and go, very heavily and jump on it and jump down on it? And, what do you say? You say, well, you only own your turn. Yes, you have 5 minutes now, but you see the line over there? And the swing has to remain in a workable condition for them. So you don't own the swing. That's the interesting thing. You only own your turn with a swing. So you have something unique here. You have some ownership. That's the uniqueness, the irreplaceability. It's just for you, the swing, just for you now, but it's not your swing. It's never going to be your swing, right? Because others used it before you. You're just getting it from them. And there are others who want to use it after you. And so the others before you and the others after you, they're already there in some way. Even though it is yours, it's just yours right now. No one else can go on the swing with you right now, just you. But they are there. You can't forget them because you only own your turn, not the swing. You see? That's what I find is useful about the notion of taking turns. And as I said, it emerges out of, this is another example, advantage, I think, it emerges out of an ontological condition, the non-coincidence of time, now is taking turns with each other. It emerges out of this natal mortal character of human agency. And if you apply it to democratic institutions, which I do with the help of Aristotle and Derrida, then it also applies to institutions, to taking turns with institutions. So more could be said about that. Now, some of the advantages also lie in the fact that you avoid what's called mereological accounting. Meros, again, also means part in ancient Greek. By mereology is the study of parts. And so if there is a whole, I take certain parts from it. What other parts do I owe you? That's mereological accounting. And that's what we do when we think about cutting a cake, for example. There are 5 kids. They all want a slice of the cake. And the first cutter, cuts a very big piece, let's say. Then the question is, well, how much does she have to leave for the other kids, right? So that's mereological accounting, the study of parts in relation to the whole. And that is the dominant model for thinking about what we owe with respect to nature to future people. That is the dominant model. But you can see that it gets into certain kinds of problems because the cake is the kind of thing that you use up in sharing it. In sharing it, you use it up. But that's not what you want to do with something like nature, right? Because it is a holistic object with holistic interrelations, you want to pass it on intact, as it were, right? As one thing. The thingness is problematic, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But and yet, you want to be able to take from it, right? So, I think with respect to an object of that kind, an object, again, in quotation marks, taking turns recommends itself. Because what it says is, it doesn't say that, oh, you can take a part and then you can calculate how much you have to leave for others. What it says is, no, the question of justice is now a different question. The question is not, how much must I substitute for what I take? But the question now is, what is it to take a fair turn with it? Just like with the swing example, the question of justice has now changed. So the question is no longer, so we want to share the swing, how much of the chain and how much of the seat do I get and how much do you get, right? That's no longer the question. The question is, what is it to take a fair turn? And I say here that, well, there are certain kinds of, in the longer version of this, I talk about these three ways. But if you can think of others in which you fill this notion of what is it to take a fair turn with content, let me know. By equivalence with respect to reception, I mean, well, you can tell to the kid on the swing, you can say, you have to leave it in at least as good a state as you encountered it in when you got to the swing. At least as good a state. Right? This is what I mean by equivalence with respect to reception. When you got it, it was in a certain condition. You cannot leave it in a worse condition. That's one. We find this, for example, in Italian trains. If you've ever taken a train in Italy, it'll say in the bathroom, please leave the bathroom in the condition in which you found it in. Right? Now, you can see the problems with that too, right? It can't be all that you want to say, for the obvious reasons that that example already indicates. It may be that you get it in a pretty bad state. The other point is that you could say, and I do think that is the most promising one, you could say that it has to be functioning for the next turn taker. So what you would say to the kid is, well, one thing, you cannot leave it in a worse state than in which you got it, but in addition to that, you have to make sure it's functioning for the next turn taker. So you have to take care of it. Now that's a little bit more. Like for a kid you might not want to say that to a kid, because if it breaks and it's not really the kid's fault, you would call on a third party to fix it, right? But if there is no such third party, because we only have the generations, and we don't have a non-historical generation that can come in and do all the fixing for us, then that's not available to you. So then you have to say, well, it's only me who can fix it for the next generation if it breaks, right? So you have to leave it in a functioning condition. And because, I'm going very quickly here, but because I argue that past and future generations are already in some sense implicated in the present generation, you can't play off one generation against another. So it is not permissible to say, I got it from the past in this state, so that's all I have to care about. I only have to look to the past. This is how I got the swing. This is how I'm going to leave it. My argument is that because both past and future are co-implicated in the present, that's not available to you. You can't just look at one generation. You must also look at the future generation. And then you get an interplay of these two. Right? Okay, but that's perhaps a bit more, involves a bit more argument that I'm willing to flesh out if we get to it. The flourishing part, that's what Alan Habib favors. So he has written, there's one paper on taking turns that's very good actually, but differs from my conception. He argues that the conception ought to be, it has to be a flourishing thing. So what you pass on has to be in a flourishing state. With respect to the earth, you might want to say, well, what is it for earth to flourish? And he would say, well, I don't know, I'm a philosopher. You have to ask ecologists and botanists and zoologists, and so how much biodiversity can we lose? And we are engaging in these kinds of calculations. And they have to come up with flourishing nature, and that's what you owe, he argues. Okay, but maybe you have other ideas. What is it to take a fair turn is the question, right? Another advantage, I think, is that it helps us to come back to the Obama quote at the beginning. There I said the issue is politically we have to think of ourselves as unique, with a unique responsibility, but at the same time understanding ourselves as only one generation in a long chain of generations stretching to the past and the future. And I think taking turns helps us to do that. Now you may say, well, how is a generation unified? You have emphasized overlap among generations, and overlap means there's constantly a new member and an old one dying off, right? Maybe not even an old one, but you see what I mean. So there's constantly this changeover within a generation, and so how is it unified? Well, it's a very good question, the best answer I've come up with is I think, implicit in the Obama quote, and that is the answer. And it's also worked out by Dilthey, by the way, who's says only the word generation only appears once in Being and Time, and then it's with reference to Dilthey. And Dilthey's conception is in fact that the unification takes place in view of some kind of a crisis. And that is, I think, what Obama says too. We are the first and the last generation with respect to climate change. Well, because climate change is a big crisis, and that's what ought to unify us as a turn taker, right? Okay, so much for the advantages. I haven't actually kept track of time, but there's only basically one more point that I want to make. Maybe I'll make that point and then I leave it at that. Well, the point is basically that when we think about intergenerational sharing in terms of taking turns, we have to beware not to overstretch the analogy with the swing example. Because the swing is something that is external to the kids that are taking turns with it. They don't have to go on the swing. They could play soccer or whatever, right? They could do something else. They don't need the swing to live. But when you think of, so the swing is not co-constitutive of who they are. So they're taking turns with something that they might also not take turns with. The thing remains external to them. Now that's not the case with Earth, with what I call Earth. I mean by Earth the history and habitat of life. The history and habitat of life. Why history and habitat? Well, history is the temporal notion and habitat is the spatial notion, and I think we need both. And so to fix that disanalogy, not to fix, but to address that disanalogy between the swing and the Earth, I speak of the precedence of Earth's own turn with us. So the Earth is now that which also turns us about, takes turns with us. And it does that on this conception by being co-implicated in the giving birth and the dying. Because there are various sources on which I draw for this, but and that is because the birth is never just birth from a preceding generation. And the living between birth and death is never just a living from other humans. And the dying is never just a dying by passing on into another generation, but it's also always a birthing, a breathing, an eating, and a dying with respect to Earth. That's what the claim here is. And so the thing with which we take turns precedes and exceeds us. It is not a consumable in the sense of the cake either. It is not that which we make, consume, and pass on, but it's what comes before us. We are born into it. It's something into which we are cast, and we cannot but leave it behind to others. Now, of course, we can leave it behind in better or in worse ways, but that's what taking turns is supposed to help us answer. What are the better ways, right? Hence the question, what is it to take a fair turn? But it remains the case that we cannot but leave it behind. Right? And so that's different with a swing or with a bicycle or other kinds of objects that you wouldn't share by cutting them up or by taking them apart. If you share a house, well, also there, you don't share it by, you get the roof and I get the walls, or you don't do that, right? You share it by, well, you get it on Tuesdays and I get it on Wednesdays and so on. That's how you share it. But then the house, well, you can build another one, but you can't build another Earth. That's different. It precedes us and it exceeds us. And that's what needs to be thought here. Now, but then what you have are two turnings, the terrestrial turning and the generational turning. So you have two kinds of turnings that you now have to think. One is, being born of Earth and passing away into Earth, as it were, and always being dependent on it, on the one hand, and on the other hand, you have generations taking turns with that object into, from which you were born and into which you pass. That's how I try to do it. So this is a little bit more complicated than what you have on the flyer that I think you made it, right? Does anyone have a copy? I promised I would talk a little bit about it, but it's hands passing on a globe from one to the other. And it's interesting that you chose an image where it's black hands passing it on to little small fingers from a child, obviously, but white. Now, you have to hear, these are the generations, and you have to think of the generations as taking turns with the Earth. So when we ask the question, what is it to take a fair turn with future people with the Earth? Then this is the conception of the Earth that we have. But really, the Earth isn't that, because then you could say, oh, they're just, they might as well not share it. It could withhold it. Or this generation, it could replace this one with another one, or not replace it, but not share at all. That's not the case. So really, the Earth is this. Right? And so you would want to see these generations coming sort of out of it here. Why did I draw these extra lines, these little lines here, instead of just the big ones? Well, because the Earth turning with us, in a way, disindividuates a generation, because it's the birthing and the dying, those are always singular events. As we said earlier, it isn't a generation that is born in whole cloth all at once and then comes on stage and goes off stage. So that's why actually these lines, they cut through generations, as it were. It's to establish what a generation is always a real social and political effort. It always requires something other than a unity given by nature, as it were. It isn't given by nature. It's always a question of social organization, political organization, and the way we think of ourselves. So really, it's really somewhat problematic, because this makes the Earth like the swing, when it isn't, when it is more like this. But nonetheless, we also have to think of it in this way, I'm suggesting, because we do have to think in terms of what is it to take a fair turns among generations. Okay. Now, to spell this out a little bit more, I have developed this idea of the human being as interred. So I'm trying to, interred means buried, but buried in the earth. So interred, you want to hear terra, earth. So in-earthed. The human being, I argue, is not accidentally placed, as it were, on the earth. And this conception of being on the earth is very important in the history of political philosophy. And Kant, for example, plays a big role. This idea that human beings are on the earth means for Kant that eventually they'll have to conceive of themselves as all belonging to one humanity, right? Because they're distributed on the surface of the earth. So the superficiality of the earth is very important in the history of political philosophy, because it does mean that humanity can come to own the earth as its territory, because it's just placed on it. And in response, I argue, well, it's not quite the way it is. We are placed in the earth, where earth, of course, means sky, climate, and sea, importantly. right? So it involves non-totalistic conceptions of the Earth. So not just the Earth as seen as a planet from the outside, which has played such a large role in the thinking of our relationship to the environment over the last 50 years or so. So I developed this conception of us as interred in stressing that our mortal agency implies that we are intrinsically tied to the Earth. And that's why I say that the mole and the hedgehog are better models for human beings than the owl or the eagle. And I'm not the first to say this, right? You find this in Nietzsche, you find this in Derrida and others. That's why I think this, the first image, man-made image from Earth, from outer space, has played a role that can be quite problematic in this respect, because it suggests that we are merely contingently placed on the Earth when really, we could be thinking about, and we should be thinking about, some people are saying, colonizing other planets. So we have a contingent relationship to the Earth, means that we should start thinking about colonizing other planets. Now that's very problematic from a taking turns, intergenerational sharing kind of perspective, because it suggests that, and these arguments are sometimes being made, not yet by serious academic philosophers to the extent I've seen, but in the popular press all the time. The suggestion that it becomes urgent for us to look for other planets because we're wrecking this one, right? And this notion of the interred condition is meant to be an answer to that. Okay, I leave it at that. Thank you very much for listening. I hope I didn't use up too much time. Thank you.